Hi, everybody. This is Professor Alex. Thank you for logging in today. Today we will be covering chapter 16 in the Sociology 3E textbook from OpenStax. I'll be following along with their slides and some slides that I added myself, and we will be discussing education. This is a decently short chapter, so I'm hoping not to take up too much of your time, but I wanted to just cover some of the more important aspects and um, just cover some important vocabulary with you. As always, you should be doing your own research. You should be reviewing the textbook and you should be reviewing the rest of the slides that I don't cover. So, in general, always review the slides, review your textbook, and do your own research about things that you have more questions about. So, again, chapter 16, education. So, let's just hop into it. So, first of all, as we know, we have our four main agents of socialization, and this is how we learn how to behave and act and navigate in society. Our four main agents are family, peers, education, and media, right? So education is a huge one in terms of how we learn to behave in society, what's expected, what would be deviant, what would be right or wrong. And so when we look at education, again, it's very influential, and we have these two types of education, many types of education, of course, but let's just start with these two terms. So formal education, when we say formal education, we're talking about like the formal um, list of things that you have to learn before you graduate, right? So like math, science, history, social studies, anything like that, anything in the curriculum. Informal education, on the other hand, is more so learning about societal and cultural values, norms, and again, expected behavior. So both of these things together, formal and informal education, are a part of cultural transmission. Cultural transmission is what it sounds like, right? When we are transmitting and giving certain, teaching kids, I guess, and adults in college, right? But I'm thinking largely in grade school where we're teaching kids how to behave and how to be a good, productive member of society, right? So in terms of cultural transmission, we're learning about, again, history, math, science, all those important things, but also how to work together, how to work in a team, how to communicate, and also like how to respect authority, right? So again, cultural transmission, how we learn values and beliefs and social norms of our culture, and both formal and informal education are a part of that. A couple of charts that I had here just regarding racial and gender inequality in terms of education. We can see here this is racial inequality at every educational level, and we are looking at average hourly pay by race and degree in dollars. Okay. We have black is white, which is kind of funny. Hispanic is red, and then the blue is for black people. And so when we look at this chart here, we see that in general, we see an upwards trend in terms of hourly pay as we get higher degrees, right? But we also see a clear racial divide here. Very consistently, we see that white people will make the most no matter what degree, and then Hispanic, and then Black people. So another thing that we might notice here is that, for example, if you, well, first of all, we see that there's not a huge difference between high school and some college, right? And this is definitely interesting, especially when it comes to like race and class in terms of starting college and not finishing it doesn't do much for you in terms of pay, right? Even just having and you click that button, like some college, it doesn't necessarily get you much more ahead than if you were to just have a high school degree. And we see this discrepancy largely for lower income and in marginalized communities in terms of maybe starting college, because that's what we push people to do in our society, right? We're like college, 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 college. And then a lot of people, first of all, college might not be for them, or they start college and aren't able to afford it or have to manage other things at home, whether that's something in your personal life or having to have other jobs. So it's just kind of interesting. This is where my hesitation is, where, if college isn't for everybody, right? And starting it and putting yourself in debt and not finishing it can, be detrimental in terms of, again, just putting you into debt for something that won't give you much of a difference in terms of, hourly pay. We also see that, for example, I also noticed that as we get to higher degrees, the differences between races gets even bigger, right? Like there isn't a huge difference here in terms of like less than high school degree or a high school degree. But once we get to the advanced degree down here, we do see that the differences are substantial, as well as having a college degree, right? So in general, having a higher degree is going to get you more pay. But it's interesting because the racial gap actually increases as we get into higher degrees. When we look at gender inequality, same question, but looking at men versus women, with men being the black bar and women being the red bar, we see that in general, men are going to make more. And here we're looking at, again, average hourly wage by gender and degree in dollars. Okay, so again, men always make more. And same with the last chart, we see that as we get to higher degrees, the disparity increases. And something that my students have pointed out is that, for example, a woman with a college degree, well, there's a few things here. Whatever. First of all, I'm looking at kind of like there's a whole $10 difference between men and women for the college degree, right? But we see, for example, men who have some college make around the same as, well, okay, no, the one that makes the most sense to point out, I apologize, is so if we look at men with a college degree at 37, let's say $37 per hour for a man with a college degree, a bachelor's. And then we look at a woman with an advanced degree, so that could be a master's or a PhD or a doctorate program. We see that women make less with an advanced degree than men do with just a bachelor's degree. So that's just interesting. Like women have to get an advanced degree to make even what men just make with a bachelor's degree. So whatever, not the most positive of charts that I have here, but I did want to point out the disparities and that the disparities increase as we get higher into degrees, which it's just not fair, not cool, because it's like, why are we going for these higher degrees as women just to make as much as a man with a much lower degree level than I have, right? And that is just incredibly frustrating because, women work hard and then are still, very much oppressed in terms of pay and equal pay and fair pay. So we definitely, I would like to, and I would encourage you to maybe look at this trend over time and see if we're making any progress. I would like to believe that we were making progress in terms of both of these things, but there is still a lot more progress that needs to, or a lot more change that needs to happen to get to a place where we are, making equal pay based on our education level, whether that be race or gender. So moving on, if we kind of look down at conflict theory, I was like, should I do? No. If you look at conflict theory, right? So a few important concepts here. First of all, cultural capital, and this kind of goes back to what we were talking about in terms of cultural transmission. So again, through education, we learned about societal values, beliefs, and norms, and again, how you're supposed to behave, right? What you're supposed to believe, what you're supposed to think, and how you're supposed to express those ideas. So when we look at cultural capital, very similar to social capital, right? So social capital is who you know, right? Think social, who you know. Social capital is who you know in terms of networking or nepotism or whatever. Cultural capital is more so what you know. Okay, so social is who you know, cultural is what you know. So cultural capital is cultural knowledge that serves as a symbolic type of currency to help one navigate that particular culture, right? And you can think of this very simply. For example, like let's say you want to go to Japan, responsibly, you should probably look into that culture a little bit, like what maybe gestures or words or things are not appropriate there, what types of things show respect there that might be different here. But just looking at cultural differences and preparing yourself wherever you're going to go travel to kind of understand that culture before you go there. Like, for example, here you need to tip at a restaurant. If you're at France and you do that, the waiter's probably going to be offended. So just doing that bit of research before you enter into a new culture that gives you cultural capital, right? So the person who does research before taking their trip to Japan versus somebody who doesn't, the person who did some research into, cultural beliefs, values, activities is going to have more cultural capital there because they're more aware of what's going on and therefore they can navigate that culture with more ease. So think the same thing here. Just cultural capital is what do you know about the current culture and how can that knowledge help you navigate life, get a job, navigate school, whatever. So again, through our education system, not only do we promote formal education, but informal education, which can, well, both formal and informal education, both of these things would inform your level of cultural capital. So even for example, how in school, I usually start off my intro classes with here's how you write an email, right? You need to address someone by the name, do some sort of formality, get to your point, have a good day, and then sign off with your full name, right? There's just basic things about, professionalism, how to be professional, and I have my critiques of professionalism, but largely sometimes you need to feed into those things to be able to make your way up and then make changes when you are in a position of more power. But, when we start off, we have to really pay attention to cultural values and norms and, what is professionalism? How do I make sure that I'm that so that I can progress and move towards like social and cultural upward mobility? Um, but so again, cultural capital, just think this is what I know and these things that I'm learning and therefore able to use to navigate society with more ease. Then if we think about hidden curriculum, we've talked about this before in class. This one comes up a lot, right? So I won't over explain it. But hidden curriculum is the knowledge that we learn through informal learning and cultural transmission. So again, going back to formal education versus informal education, when we're talking about hidden curriculum, we are not talking about formal education. We are not talking about the official curriculum. We're not talking about math and science and reading, right? We're talking more so about cultural values, norms, and expected behaviors. So again, hidden curriculum would be the knowledge that people learn through informal learning and cultural transmission. So we see a lot of things here, and I'm going to list off some things. I'm not saying that they are necessarily bad or good because it's not that black and white. It never is. But when we think hidden curriculum, what I think about is dress codes. Raise your hand if you would like to speak. Don't speak unless called on. Don't talk to your classmates while you're in lecture. Respect authority, respect your teacher, respect the principal. We see a clear hierarchy there, right? Even having line leaders can start to teach this idea of hierarchy and who's at the top and respect that person who's at the top, and everyone else should kind of just fall in line quite literally with this example, right? Another one that my students bring up a lot is varying rules about going to the bathroom and having to ask to go to the bathroom. I've heard some students say that bathrooms not allowed after lunch or that there's certain time set aside or just a variety of rules regarding going to the bathroom, right? And I understand that when it comes to younger children, right? I've had some primary school teachers be like, well, if we don't have these rules, then it's going to be a mess. And I totally understand that. I'm not saying that these rules don't have a reason, but I do think it's interesting as you get older, right? Like in college, please don't ask to go to the bathroom. Just go to the bathroom. You go to the bathroom, go to the bathroom, right? But again, it can be kind of ideas of social control, social sanctions, um, inferring different types of deviance. And, you can argue, well, if I let them go to the bathroom, then they're just gonna run off and never come back. Like, I understand that there are reasons for some of these rules, of course, but all of these things kind of lead to this idea that largely schools are teaching you to be a good and compliant worker. They're preparing you to go to work and to be a compliant, respectful worker who, doesn't really question their place and kind of knows how to behave correctly in a workspace. Even thinking about, I ask my students, like, how long do y'all have for lunch break at work? And some people say 15, some people say 25, but you have a very limited time to go to lunch at school and at work, right? And limited time to kind of go to the bathroom and even if you wanted to take a phone call at work, you kind of have to be like, can I go take this phone call? Like da da da. So just kind of teaching students how to be good workers is largely what a lot of the hidden curriculum kind of points towards. You could also think about like nationalism and the way that we have to say the Pledge of Allegiance before class in grade school, and kind of just reiterating certain ideas about nationalism and loyalty to the country. And again, just kind of blindly respecting authority and established rules and policies and ideologies about how we're supposed to behave in society. So I don't know, definitely if you're watching this, you can add more examples of hidden curriculum in the comments, and that would be awesome. One more thing that I think of with hidden curriculum, just to kind of give you a variety of examples, I think about and with hidden curriculum, like it's not necessarily purposeful or conscious, right? It's not that anyone's trying to do this. It's more so due to the word hidden, more so implicit or like subconscious, I would say largely. So, for example, when teachers in grade school are like, can all the strong boys help me lift the chairs or move the tables or whatever? And then you're sitting there as a little girl and you're like, well, I'm strong too. And no one's saying, hey, know your place as a girl. You should just, sit and let the men do this. Like, no one's explicitly saying that. But through these kind of messages of, oh, can all the strong boys help me move the tables? You're getting this idea of your place in society as a young girl or as a young woman and learning, this is my place, this is their place, this is what I'm expected to do, and this is what they're expected to do. So it can be things like that. Doesn't have to be aggressive. It's largely subtle. And again, that's why it's called hidden curriculum. It's not necessarily in your face, but if you reflect back to, certain ideas that you learned in grade school, you might notice that a lot of that might be hidden curriculum. And again, not inherently bad or good, but it is in general teaching you how to be a, compliant and complacent and, appropriate contributing member of society. Another term that I think is interesting is tracking. And, maybe we can talk about this more in class, but tracking is, I found that it's very different depending on where you go to school. For me, it was like AP, honors, level one, level two, and then like special education. So any sort of tracking or hierarchy in grade school where it's like, oh, these are the upper level kids, or these are the lower level kids, or these are the struggling kids, or these are the I don't know, the super smart, the honors kids, whatever. Um, I think about even like I read a research paper recently about some guy in education who was saying that we need to stop using the term students who are at risk and instead kind of flip that to be like these are students who are at promise. And that's important because if you think back to labeling theory, which, as a recap, labeling theory has to do with self-fulfilling prophecies in terms of if someone tells you all the time, oh, you're so smart, you're an honor student, you're so smart, you got this, like you're at the top of your game, da 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 da, you're gonna be more motivated to be that, to be good. People that you love and that you respect are around you and they're saying, you got this, you're smart. The school system saying that you're smart. You're gonna internalize that and do well. Your projection is gonna look better. Versus if we continue to, if you continuously tell a student, oh, you're at risk, oh, you're a problem student, oh, you're in special ed, like this is all you'll ever be, like you whatever, like if you're being relegated to that position, you might internalize that as part of your identity. And again, towards that self-fulfilling prophecy of, well, all I've ever been told or treated as or placed as has been a lower level student or an at-risk student or a student who has special needs of any sort. You might internalize that and therefore your outcome might not be as good as somebody who was labeled as something more positive. So when I think about tracking, I don't have, an answer on how to fix this. I've read some research from California and they have been introducing new practices to combat tracking or combat the outcomes of tracking. And I guess I should start there. So like the issue with tracking is like, okay, so I'll just use me for example. I'm horrible at math, right? I think I graduated high school with like algebra 2, right? And then my best friend Hannah, who is always labeled as super smart. And in the honors classes, I think she graduated with like trigonometry. Like she was like three classes ahead of me. Like I think she took calc, she took trig, and like something else. Like she graduated like three classes ahead of me. And so, for example, now we go into college, and now I have to take more math courses than she does. She's already met the requirement. She doesn't have to take more math classes, whereas I did. They were like, well, now you need to take Algebra 2 again so we can make sure that you're up to par. And that's just like one example, but think about the cumulative impact of being multiple classes behind in multiple subjects and then going to college. And then largely, this happens to lower income students or minority students, whether by gender or by race. We see that largely it's going to be more affluent white students or more affluent white males who place better, who are in these higher classes, and therefore they go to college and they're somewhat ahead or at least very much on track, whereas other people might be behind. And again, now you have to spend money, extra money on extra college classes just to get where everybody else was. So when we look at, and I should have added a chart, but when we look at the impact of tracking, we see that lower income students and more marginalized communities in terms of minorities, racial, economic, gender, whatever, minorities tend to start farther behind, right? Looking at just different barriers that people have. And then you have, again, minorities having to take extra classes in college to catch up, paying extra money to do that, and spending extra time to do that. And that might deter some people from continuing on with college, or just not excelling at the same rate as more privileged students may have been. And you can also think of this largely as a monetary thing in terms of if you have more money from a more affluent family, you can afford like tutoring, right? Same thing with like the SAT. You can get an SAT tutor, you can get any sort of tutor or after school help. Whereas somebody who's more low income isn't going to have extra money for a tutor to help their kid get ahead, if you know what I mean. So there is a real impact on outcomes of minorities when it comes to tracking. It can largely deter people or put them vastly behind other students who are privileged in other ways. And so again, just for example, in California, what they're doing, or one thing that they're doing, and I want to say no one really has a good answer on how to do this yet. We're exploring it. So I encourage you to think deeper about this issue and think about if you have any suggestions or strategies or ideas on how to kind of mitigate the impact of tracking. And if you do have any ideas, put them in the comments. I would love to hear. But one example, again, in California is one tactic is, so imagine like you put everybody in the same class, right? Like let's just put everybody in the same class. There's this one group of teachers who is just using like a three basket system, right? So the first basket is, hey, I really understand this. I have a good grasp on this. I'm not having any issues. Second basket might be like, I feel pretty good about this. Like I have some questions, but like I'm feeling decently well and confident about this. And the third basket might be like, hey, I'm struggling with this. I don't really understand this. I need help. So what they do is they pair up the students who are overly confident, like above and beyond, really understand this concept, with the students who don't really understand this concept. And then they put them together and have, again, the more confident student try to explain to the student who needs extra help, right? And it's funny because sometimes my students are like, well, that's not my responsibility to teach them and da 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 da. And you're right, you're right. But I also think that that comes from the fact that we live in such an individualistic a country and society where we really do just privilege and focus on our own success rather than the success of our community. So I hear you where, that's maybe not always something you want to do, but I do challenge you to think about the fact that, the more communal we can be, the more successful we can be as a society. And I know not everyone is a natural teacher or wants to teach, but I think that's also a benefit of this idea where you were teaching students to teach, to help each other, to look out for the people who are struggling, to make sure that you're paying attention and that you're caring about those around you. And this goes into, teamwork skills and leadership skills. And I think if you care about the people around you, whether that's at school or at work, more likely everyone's going to be more successful. And so I think that that could teach, the more confident kids, hey, yeah, you understand this. And now what's your responsibility now that you really understand this? Like, are you just gonna be like, oh yeah, I understand this, la di da di da, I'm gonna just go do whatever? Or can we instill some sense of responsibility where it's like, okay, you do really understand this. How can we spread that information? How can we spread that knowledge? How can we educate and give back in that way? So I know not everyone needs to, agree with that, but I do think it would be a cool way to reiterate and reintroduce a sense of community in schools and therefore in work and in other settings. So I also think that in terms of, I don't know, the one who really understands explaining it to somebody else, I think that people always say this with teaching. Every teacher will say this. I didn't really fully understand the concept or this idea until I had to teach it. So it's like, yeah, you can understand it while you're doing it on your paper and you're doing your math, but having to actually explain that in a way that makes sense to other people really solidifies that understanding for yourself. If you understand it, but you can't explain it without being convoluted, you don't really understand it that well, right? You have to learn how to explain things in a concise way that's simple, where you're using words and terminology that everyone can understand so that we can all be on the same page. So, I'm sure that there are benefits and pros and cons, and that's not the only way to deal with tracking. I would suggest that you look more into it. I'm sure other states are doing it now, but mostly California has been working on projects. So if you want to look more into that, I encourage you. And I do think that's something that we need to think about more as a society because this is an issue and we need to figure out how to kind of at least minimize the inequality that comes from it. Moving forward, I mean, okay, I think standardized tests are interesting, and I do feel like I almost need to come back to oh no, not my email. I feel like I need to come back to this types of intelligence wheel that I bring up all the time, so I apologize, but I think it's important. When we think about intelligence, and that's different than IQ, like there's an IQ test, right? But the IQ test purports to test intelligence, and I would disagree with that, but whatever. This is my favorite little chart here when I think about like types of intelligence. And there's more than this, but these are the main ones, right? So spatial, maybe you're a good architect, right? You want to build things or even design gardens or something like that. Naturalist, this is understanding living things or nature. Like I always think of my sister who went to Hawaii to get a certificate in organic farming, right? Like that's an intelligence I'll never understand. And I think that's really neat. And that's a very important thing in society, right? How else would we eat? Musical, right? You could be a great violinist or pianist. That's never going to be tested in an SAT, an ACT, a GRE, or an IQ test, right? And that's kind of my point is that when you look at SAT, ACT, GRE, any sort of standardized testing, really the only things that you're looking at is math, science, writing, and reading, right? That's largely the same thing for all of those tests, unless you choose to take a specialized test, which I know they have a couple of different specialized ones that you can take. But again, that's extra money. But so again, there are people who again, very good logical, mathematical. That's a basic one that will be covered. Linguistic, finding the right words to express what you mean. So that would be reflected largely on a standardized test in terms of being able to write and comprehend. But other ones are like existential skills, right? This is someone who might want to go into philosophy, like why do we live? Why do we die? Like maybe that's someone who's into theology, right? Interpersonal skills, being able to understand and communicate with other people. Intrapersonal skills is being able to understand yourself and how you feel and how you emotionally regulate. You could also look at like bodily kinesthetic knowledge, right? If someone's a bodybuilder, that's so a type of intelligence. You know what I mean? Like that takes a lot. That takes a lot of dedication, a lot of nutritional information and physical physiological whatever. I'm trying to say understanding the body and how that works on a physical level and on like a neurological level and whatever, understanding how what you eat and what you do impacts the body. Like you're going to be a personal trainer or a nutritionalist, right? So I'm just trying to say that there's many types of intelligence and the SAT and the ACT, for example, really limit it down to, again, writing, reading, math, and science. So it's interesting because, I mean, I'm sure, we know that there's going to be issues here, and I'll get into kind of like racial and gender differences with the standardized testing. But I do think that it largely comes back to like economics and money, right? And funding. So on a more macro level, funding of the schools and ensuring that they have the right resources and ability to teach people how to do this. Like there are some high schools that have the funding and the ability to, like I remember at my high school, we had a whole class for a whole year on like how to test for the SAT and the ACT. And like we were trained to do that, right? Not every school has that. Not every school has a professor or a teacher who can do that. And so some schools also put more funding into getting high test scores and some focus on other things. So again, on a more macro level, like what funding does the school have? And as I've mentioned in class, but just to reiterate, the funding of the public school comes from property tax. So that is how much taxes you pay on your house. The more expensive the house, the more you pay in taxes. So if you live in a more affluent area with bigger houses and more expensive houses, the public school will be more highly funded. It's that simple. But then on a more micro or individual level, if your family has more money, then you can afford to have an SAT tutor, right? You can afford to have that tutor, to have those extra classes. And you can also afford to take the SAT and the ACT more than once. It's been interesting listening to my students. I've heard that some of y'all, your high schools will cover the cost of your first SAT or ACT, and that's like incredible, and I wish. But a lot of people do have to just pay the cost themselves out of pocket, and maybe, you can take it once. I think it's $100, $120. Y'all will have to comment and let me know how much it costs now, but I know it's around $100. And I think how it works, or at least how it worked when I was in school, was that you could take a super score. So, for example, if I took two SAT tests and I did really good on my reading score for this one and really good on my math score for this one, for the college that I want to send it to, they'll take the super score. They'll look at my best math score over here and my best reading score over here and take the best scores from all of the tests that I've taken. But again, if you don't have money to take multiple tests, you don't really get the opportunity to do a super score or to try to score better on the second one. And I do think that people in general do better on the second one because now you know what to expect. So, whatever, on a macro level, the funding of the school, on a micro level, the amount of family funds that you have to be able to focus on this, even time, right? Like, if you have to work extra jobs, if you're working after school, you don't have as much time to study or prepare for the SAT test. Another thing that I'm thinking of right now is even like when I just took the GRE, those like I'm trying to like when you get those like practice tests or like practice books, like they are so much money. I remember I bought one off of my friend for like cheap. Okay, well these are looking okay. Okay, maybe I'm confused. I remember when I wanted a GRE book, it was like $300, and so I ended up like buying one off of my friend for like half price. But yeah, let's just say the official GRE Superpower Pack, which obviously probably no one needs, $72, right? So again, if $72 is nothing to you, you have access to a super power pack where you get an official guide, an official example exams and whatnot so that you can practice and prepare. Whereas for me, even now I wouldn't drop $72 on a power pack. Like that's crazy. So I'm just saying, even if you have more money, you can really prep for these things more. So whatever, I digress. Let me go into some stats regarding this. So first of all, let's look at um, gender and race, and then I want to show you this chart up here, which is kind of depressing. But I guess they all are depressing, but it's okay. It gives us. I know a lot of it can be discouraging, but the point is to notice where we are lacking so that we can make moves to make progress in these areas. So I'm sorry if this is like depressing or whatever. But again, we have to at least be aware of these disparities so that we can hopefully make. Oh, I heard my dog. I was like, where are you? Okay, it's fine. I heard him snoring. But okay, I digress. So if we're looking at, I think these are both math scores. Yeah, these are both mean math scores for the SAT. This is 2015, so it is a bit outdated. So you can definitely look up a more recent one. I'm like, yeah, that is a decade ago at that point, huh? I would assume it's similar, but definitely do look up more recent charts if you would like to. But so this is this is kind of confusing. These are the scores at the bottom from lowest to highest scoring. So really all you need to focus on is let's just focus on the top scoring right here and who is top scoring. So what you will see is that Asian people do score higher on the math SAT portion of the test. And let's just be very clear. Let's go back to our knowledge on race. Even, okay, you know how we're talking about like gender expectations? Gender expectations drive gender differences, right? So, well, I guess I should start. Yeah, let me start here. I'm so sorry. It's the same thing, right? So if we're looking at mean math scores on the SAT, we see that pink is female and blue is male, right? So we do see that in general, men score better. I feel like I feel like I'm missing a part of this chart low key. Because it should have had years at the bottom. Whoops. Okay, well, should I try to look it up right now? Mean, let me see. Let's see if you can just like pull it up real quick. If not, I digress. Okay, yeah. Okay, see this one has the actual years. I knew I was like missing something. I apologize. When I copy and pasted that, it must have just messed up. But okay, sorry. Let's move on. So this is like over a time period from 1996 to 2011. And so we see that I'm trying to determine if the gap is closing at all. It looks like it is a little bit, but the gap has stayed pretty consistent. I wish we could have seen it close a little bit more at the end here. And again, maybe we need to look at something, 2011 to 2020 for sure. But yeah, it doesn't really, I wish the gap was closing more, but we do see that men score better on the math aspect of the SAT. And so this is what I wanted to bring up, going back to our knowledge on gender and gender differences, is that gender expectations drive gender differences, right? So men are not just better at math naturally. Nobody's naturally better at something than anybody else based on gender or race, which are social constructs, right? But based on the expectations that we have for boys and that they're supposed to be better at math. Therefore, teachers give them more attention in math classes, are more likely to call on them in math classes, not purposefully, but subconsciously due to certain implicit biases we have, but also drawing back to the different toys that we give children, right? So for little boys, we're more likely to give Legos and building blocks and trucks and dinosaurs and fire trucks and I don't know, all sorts of like even those like cool like science kits that you give to kids or where you like make volcanoes or you're looking for dinosaur bones or whatever. Those largely go to little boys, whereas little girls get cooking sets. They get babies, even though they are babies. They get, tea sets. They get like kitchen sets where they can learn to wash the dishes and stay in the kitchen, right? Even as a young child. So, for girls, we give them certain toys and those, so our expectation that women are supposed to be nurturing and empathetic, we give them toys that perpetuate that. Whereas again, we see that, if you look at like developmental psychology, we see that boys are better at like spatial reasoning. But again, that's because we get them Legos and like building blocks and Lincoln logs and stuff. So it's our expectations about gender differences that actually drive gender differences. So again, it's not that men are just better at math, it's that we expect them to be better at math. So we give them stuff that's math related, and then we give them more, we hype them up more when it comes to math. We expect them to be good at math. So it kind of goes into that self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Like labeling theory, like, oh, you're a guy, you're going to be great at math, we're to call on you, blah, blah, blah. It's going to perpetuate the idea and the gender differences in that men are better at math. So again, not naturally, but based on socialization and social expectations about gender differences that drive this actual change. And so then we can say the same thing here when we look at the racial gap in terms of not just race, but more so cultural expectations, right? So in terms of like Asian families, there are different cultural expectations. Is it that Asians are just naturally smarter? No, it's not like that, right? There is no race that's smarter than another. There's no gender that's smarter than another. It just doesn't make sense. These things are social constructs, but cultural expectations drive cultural differences, right? There's different cultural expectations specifically, let's just say for Asian people, where they are expected to perform well. And that might be something that is passed down generationally, and is also part of their cultural transmission in terms of passing down what is important regarding cultural capital for you to be successful. So again, that's not just that Asian people are just naturally smarter, it's that there are cultural differences for all of these things, right? So think less race, think more culture. But what we do see is that if we're looking at the top scores, we see that Asian people are over, I was trying to say overpopulated, that's crazy. Uh, Represented more in the higher area of the scores. Yeah, ignore me. And then after that, we see that white people score the second best after them, and then we see who's the weird, okay, Latino and Black. Yeah, yep. So it really goes from Asian to white to Latino to Black in terms of who is really doing well on the specifically the math section of the SAT, but you can look into the other aspects as well for sure. This is also 2015, so again, if you want to look at more recent maps, you can do that as well. These are just the clearest graphs that I could find to kind of hit on my point. So whatever. So we see those things, and so that kind of brings me back up to here, right, where we see here, in 2020, a slate of highly selective colleges eliminated their standardized test requirement for admission. And in 2021, several colleges expanded and extended their test optional approach. I don't have an issue with eliminating. I do have an issue with test optional. Let's look at that, okay? So when we look at this graph here, what we're looking at is the correlation of test submissions and admission rates. So take a second to look at this, right? So they are comparing 2021 and 2022. Honestly, I'm not worried about that comparison. That will make it more convoluted. Let's just look at the light blue is the admittance rate with no test. Oh wait, let's just look at 2022. Let's just look at the orange ones because it's more recent, right? So the fully filled one is the admission rate with the test submitted, and then the dashed one, the slashed one, the not fully filled in one is the I can't say admittance rate if you don't submit the test. Okay, y'all know what I'm saying. So what's interesting here is that so these are schools that have the test as optional, right? This test optional approach where they're saying you don't have to submit the test, no worries. We're gonna try to be, I don't know if they're trying to be woke, I don't know what they're trying to do, but they're saying that you don't have to submit it to apply here. And like that's cute and that's nice. But if we look at this chart, and again, this is recent, this is they're looking at 2022 here. If you look at the admission rate for let's just use BC. Let's just start here, right? If we're looking at the admission rate for students who go to BC who submitted the test and who didn't submit the test, we see that if you submit the test, you are 2.7 times more likely to be admitted. Let's look at Emory. Not familiar, but that's okay. So if same thing here, the admission rate, if you do submit the test, even though it's optional, is 2.7 times higher than if you don't, right? Let's look at I want to look at more orange ones. Notre Dame, right? We see that at Notre Dame, you're twice as likely to get accepted if you do submit the test. Same thing with like, I don't know, Tufts. Well, okay, Tufts, there's less of a difference, so that's cool, but you still are more likely to get admitted if you do submit the test. So it's just interesting to me because I think if we were going to try to create some sort of equal playing field, we would have to completely eliminate the standardized test because what we see is that when there is an option to submit the test, those who submit the test are more likely to get into college. So take with that what you will. It's just good to know. And it's just, I would say with any of these kind of rules or policies that come up, we do need to double check, hey, is this effective in the way that we want it to be effective, or is it actually just creating more of a disparity in terms of equal access to education? So that's just kind of an interesting one to me. I don't really have much else to talk about. I was really just going to lightly mention the fact that prior to like 19, I know they proposed this IDEA Act in like 19, I thought like in the late 1960s, but it wasn't really like ratified or into law until 1990 is what I was reading. So again, that's the American with Disabilities Act that touches on individuals with disabilities and education. So that wasn't really like officially put through till 1990. And then the No Child Left Behind Act, which increases resources and focus on students with disabilities, was not really passed till 2002. So before like 1960, and that's me being generous, like people with disabilities of any sort, whether physical or mental, were not really allowed to come to school or had to fight to come to school, or when they got to school didn't really have the same opportunities or help that other students did. And so this is something that's still definitely an issue, still definitely needs work. Nowadays I feel like it's a lot better though in terms of like IEPs, like individual educational plans. And I think that because of these things being passed, we've had more people who have gone to school for special education and to focus on people with disabilities and making sure that they have equal opportunities in terms of education and equal opportunity to learn in a way that works for them. But it is interesting because it still feels very, very recently new in terms of history of the US. And it's just interesting to look at or to think about how that may have had like a generational impact as well. And I guess I also want to bring it up because it's something that we still need to work on, right? And I feel like this is becoming a bigger field. I feel like people now understand that this is important. We still have more work to do. And one of those points might be looking at people with ADHD or dyslexia or anything else like that. Like ADHD, it's one of those things where you can argue that it's underreported or overdiagnosed either way, but at the same time, there's still a lot of people who do have ADHD who aren't diagnosed early enough and therefore struggle. And there are people, I was actually in an Uber the other day, and the guy was, of course, telling me his life story about his son who now plays for like the Rams, like NFL or whatever. I don't know football, but he was saying that he felt bad because he was wicked hard on his son when he was young about like reading and writing and like doing well in school and math. And he's like, I don't know why you're not just getting this. Like, what the heck? And then years later, like more recently, they found out he was dyslexic, and he was just sharing with me, the guilt that he feels about how hard he was on his son. And it's like you didn't know, and sometimes you don't even know that you could test for that or that dyslexia is a thing. And he said that it was pretty new to him as a concept. He didn't know that that was a thing, or he didn't really understand it at first, but now he kind of lives with that guilt. And not to make it sad, but I'm just saying that there are a lot of disorders, even like autism spectrum disorder, like that's something that a lot of women are not diagnosed with until later on in life. So just I would just say being aware of the fact that everybody has their issues, everybody has their struggles, being aware of that, making sure that we're staying compassionate, empathetic, that we're listening, and that again that we're putting effort into helping other people because we don't really know what they're going through, even if that's just on a personal, emotional level. But we'll see that a lot of people, we see a lot of people who have ADHD and, even myself, like they'd always put me in a corner. They're like, you talk too much, you're bouncing around, you're doing this, you're distracting the class. And kind of always made me like the bad kid, like the goof off, right? Like the one who's just distracting the whole class. And like I was, but I also had like undiagnosed ADHD where it's like, dang, if anyone could have just like clocked this a little bit earlier, maybe I would have done a lot better with some help. And I'm sure that a lot of you have been there as well, where you don't really find a diagnosis until later on in life and you look back and you're like, wow, like that's why I was like that. Or maybe I would have done better if I did get tested for that earlier, or if someone around me noticed, or whatever, right? So I just would say in general, I don't know how to solve this issue, and I'm not going to try to, in a recorded lecture, but it's something to think about. And, again, my goal as a teacher is I can't solve anything, but I hope I can give you information that might inspire you to figure out how to solve something. And this is definitely an issue that we need to work on in terms of, yeah, having inclusive classrooms, in terms of being culturally competent, about being aware of people's backgrounds and experiences and struggles and how that might impact their learning experience and the way that people do learn, which is going to be different for everybody, right? There's not one cookie cutter method that's going to work for everybody. And we have to be so for real about that, right? So, whatever, just be patient, be kind, and, always just be looking out for each other and for yourself, advocate for others as well. And, I don't know. I think the best that we can do right now is pay attention to these discrepancies that we have and these inequities that we have so that we can focus on creating a more equitable future for everybody, where everybody has an equal opportunity to learn and not even equal opportunity because equal would be given the same thing, more so equitable, right? Having a chance to have equitable learning where you're given the resources that you need so that you can be successful. I think that we have the brains and the resources to do that in the US. I know that we can. I know that we care enough. So we just have to make some positive moves. And I know that you all will be a big part of that change. So y'all give me a lot of hope and I appreciate that. So I'm going to end this off here. But if you have any questions, of course, drop them in the comments, send me an email. I'd love to hear about your thoughts or even your experiences in school. If you have any suggestions for other people who are struggling with different things as they're going through their educational journey. Um, if you're older and you've already been through college, if you have any advice to, other college students who are working on it right now, anything like that. I love experiences and I love hearing your perspectives, examples, and especially advice to each other. So thank you all for tuning in today. I appreciate you all being patient and working through this with me. And I am looking forward to seeing all of you soon. Well, at least my students. I'm looking forward to seeing y'all soon. But for everybody else, thank you for logging in anyway. And I hope that you learned a little bit of something. Bye.